All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Emily Trelevin. I'm on the Population Studies Center Brown Bag Committee this year, and I'm really excited about our speaker today, Leigh Senderowicz. I will introduce her in a minute, but Leigh has asked that we hold all questions until the end. So save your questions. For those who are on Zoom, I will also be monitoring the chat during the presentation and can share questions during the Q&A. And then at 1 o'clock, Leigh will be meeting with any trainees who are interested in talking with her. So thanks everyone for coming. Leigh Senderowicz is a social demographer and critical global health researcher. She's currently an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she has a joint appointment in the departments of Gender and Women's Studies and Obstetrics and Gynecology. Leigh earned her doctorate in public health from Harvard and her master's in public health from Johns Hopkins, focusing on global reproductive health. And her interdisciplinary work focuses on contraceptive coercion and autonomy, exploring the ways that new approaches to measurement and evaluation can promote person-centered care and reproductive freedom. Thank you, Leigh.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really delighted to be here with you all today. I want to give an extra special thanks to the folks who invited me, Sarah and Emily, and then also, I guess Rachel just stepped out for a second, but like big, huge thanks to Rachel for being a miraculous organizer and setting everything up so well. So in the introduction that Emily just gave me, you heard that I spend a lot of time thinking about reproductive health and autonomy. And I have a particular focus on this feedback loop between how we measure things and what programs do, and then how we measure that, and then what programs do. And I start with this understanding that what we measure really impacts how we understand the social world, the world around us. And I look at reproductive health indicators as a form of gendered and racialized knowledge production. And I try to think about how we can better design our metrics to advance a reproductive justice agenda. And so today I'll be talking about that in particular in relationship to contemporary global family planning programs. So just a brief outline of my talk today. I'll start with some background on coercion in global family planning and the rationale for this work. Then I'll move into a discussion of what I call the tacit ideology of global family planning measurement. Then I'll spend the bulk of our time today on the Contraceptive Autonomy Study, which is the centerpiece of my research agenda. I'm going to share some of our qualitative findings, some of our quantitative findings, and how we're using that to develop a new family planning measurement. And then I'll conclude with just a few words about what I hope we can all take away from this. So let's get started with some context. And I always like to start with the question, why do we care about family planning? And it turns out that different people have really different reasons why they come to care about family planning, right? So in the global discourse on family planning in our global health world, the development world, there's a myriad of different rationales that have been offered for why we should promote family planning, including a feminist rationale to promote contraception as a matter of bodily autonomy, an environmental rationale to protect biodiversity, to alleviate climate change, an economic rationale to increase economic growth, achieve a demographic dividend, reduce poverty, and then, of course, a public health rationale to promote both maternal and child. And so this screenshot, I guess the type is a little bit tiny for those of you sitting in the back, but this is a screenshot from a family planning advocacy website that shows how all of these arguments are deployed at once. They're framing family planning as, quote, the smartest investment that we can make, capable of improving outcomes in everything from HIV/AIDS to education, to sanitation, to malaria, as well as bringing significant savings across sectors. And in this way, family planning is portrayed as a sort of panacea or a silver bullet to the multidimensional challenges of global poverty, unsafe living conditions, and ill health. And with so much upside, look at all that family planning can do, and really no stated downside, the challenge in global family planning has been framed as how we can maximize uptake to its highest levels possible. But of course, we all need to remember that despite all of these benefits, family planning has not always been an emancipatory project for all people since its inception, right? Instead, family planning has been tied in with a range of efforts to control not only fertility overall, but also to decide whose bodies are targeted for fertility reduction. So here in the United States, the eugenics movement targeted the bodies of minoritized racial and ethnic groups, disabled people, people living in poverty, among others, for compulsory sterilization. This is a photo of civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who many of you might know from her work on civil rights and voting rights. But Ms. Hamer also helped to popularize the term Mississippi appendectomy to describe the involuntary sterilization of Black women throughout the US South. This actually happened to Ms. Hamer herself. She was given a non-consented radical hysterectomy by a white doctor in 1961 when she was undergoing surgery for a small tumor. The reproductive justice framework that I'm sure many of you are familiar with was developed by Black women here in the US in the mid-1990s to highlight the deficiency of existing reproductive health paradigms to address these intersectional challenges. But for those of you who work more domestically than internationally, what I really want to highlight here is that while the reproductive justice framework has been increasingly influential in the reproductive health research here and elsewhere in the global north, these concepts have not been nearly as widely embraced by the global health community. So let's turn let's turn our attention to global health now for a second, because after the Second World War, neo-Malthusian concerns about global overpopulation were really central to the birth of the international development sector. The U.S. Agency for International Development was founded in 1961, and that very same year, the same year as it was founded, the agency began funding family planning research as one of its very first activities. Again, the type might be a little small for you, you folks in the back, but this is a screenshot from the USAID's family planning website. And you can see how Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon all motivated US development assistance for global family planning as a way to control overpopulation in poor countries. President Johnson said that he would seek new ways to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population and the growing scarcity of world resources, while President Nixon called population growth one of the most serious challenges to human destiny. Serious challenges to human destiny. So given these stark stakes, these apocalyptic stakes, right? The most serious challenge to human destiny. The legitimacy of coercion in the pursuit of fertility decline was frequently affirmed throughout this era. The president of the Population Council, for example, in 1979, published a paper in PDR calling for what he called a stepladder approach to the population problem. Bernard Burleson at that time wrote that there are, quote, undoubtedly cases of justified coercion, but he cautioned that, quote, overt violence or other potentially injurious coercion is not to be used before non-injurious coercion has been exhausted. So basically, we should use the least harmful forms of coercion possible to achieve the declines in fertility that we need to see. Many countries in the global south adopted population policies, including economic penalties for high fertilities, quotas for providers, and compulsory sterilization for women. For example, in Singapore, whose family planning messaging you can see there on the right, there were financial penalties levied among families who had more than 2 children. And in India, to this day, there are still financial payments and other incentives for women who agreed to get sterilized. And as you can see here, I hope you can see it, it's a little bit fuzzy. The amount of the sort of incentive that you get depends on how many children you've already had before you decide to get sterilized. So if you agree to your sterilization at a lower parity, your incentive is higher than if you've already had a lot of children. Of course, this hasn't gone unopposed, right? So feminist scholars have long described the ways that scientific racism, misogyny, and Western hegemony have suffused the development project since its inception, and the particular ways that the gendered and racialized logic of global family planning target poor women of color living in poor countries for fertility reduction. And really importantly, feminists from around the world have organized to contest these types of reproductive violence that were being perpetrated in the name of population control. So here you have a poster from San Francisco-based artist Rachel Romero, who created this image in 1977 to contest the forced sterilizations that were going on there at the time. As many of you, I'm sure know already, all of this really came to a head in 1994, which is the year that the UN organized the International Conference on Population and Development, which took place in Cairo. And this conference became the really well-known reckoning, right, where substantial feminist opposition confronted the population control establishment and demanded an end to coercive family planning. And so the conventional wisdom is sort of represented here in this article from The Lancet. They write that the Cairo conference put the ideas of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, choice, women's empowerment, and a life cycle approach, and gender equity at the center of the international agenda and signaled the end of the so-called population era. So that's the conventional wisdom. 1994 was when we ended population control. And there's this claim that the Cairo conference changed everything. We have what folks call the post-Cairo shift, in which the focus on population control and demographic targets is supposed to be replaced by a much more holistic focus, right, on reproductive health, on gender equity and rights. It's my contention that this shift has been much more successful as a rhetorical maneuver in terms of changing what we talk about than it has been a substantive maneuver in terms of changing what we do. And I argue that the fertility reduction rationale still remains very much intact throughout global family planning programs today. And here I'll just show a few examples of state-sanctioned contraceptive coercion in the years since Cairo. So there have been efforts to control fertility overall, like the one-child policy that was in effect in China until 2016, sterilization camps, which operated in India through 2016, efforts focusing on ethnic minority groups, like in Peru, where indigenous women were targeted under the Fujimori government until 2000. Examples where people with disabilities or living with chronic diseases are targeted. This is a case from Namibia where women living with HIV were sterilized. Programs targeting women of color and particularly women of African descent, like this example from Israel from 2013. Examples where trans folks and other gender minorities are being targeted, like this example from Europe from 2017. Lots of examples of people living in poverty and poor folks being targeted, like this example from Australia. Examples of folks with intellectual disabilities being targeted, like this example from the UK from a couple years ago. And from the US, I had a really large number of examples from which to choose. I went with this example where incarcerated people are being targeted. This is from 2017 in Tennessee. And so here you have examples of contemporary contraceptive coercion in every inhabited continent in the world, targeting just about every type of marginalized group you can think of across axes of race, ethnicity, gender, disability, class, geography, coloniality, and more. But you might be thinking, and I think maybe reasonably, that these headline-making cases of rights abuses are really a far cry from how most mainstream family planning programs operate day to day, right? These are outliers. That's sort of how we tend to think about it. These are outliers. That's not how the sort of USAID funded or Gates funded global health programs are operating. And it's really important, I think, to note that virtually all of those mainstream family planning programs have denounced these types of overtly coercive practices, and they really do take a lot of care to affirm the importance of voluntarism in their programs. And so I think it really would be easy to dismiss these cases as examples of outliers, maybe a few rogue providers, out-of-touch bureaucrats, but that doesn't really have much to do with like the meat of the global family planning movement. But what I'd like to argue today is that the reality of this stratified reproduction and the ideological focus on keeping certain people in certain places from having too many babies is really woven throughout the very heart of the contemporary family planning movement. And I think we can see that in particular if you look at our research agenda in global family planning. And so, for example, let's take a look at what we're measuring. And so we're going to talk about the tacit ideology of measurement. This is another example. I'm sorry, I wish I could have made this bigger, but this is a screenshot from an article in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization. It's the outcome of a convening that the WHO called of global family planning experts to conduct a priority setting exercise for family planning research. And so a bunch of experts got together in a room and they talked about what are the most important things for us to be focusing on in our family planning research in the next few years. And if you look at what they decided, priority number 1 was to identify barriers to uptake. Priority number 2 was to look at how to improve uptake. Priority number 3, how to increase uptake. And priority number 4 was how to increase uptake. So I'm simplifying a little bit, right? There's like some interest in some of it's post-abortion uptake, some of it's postpartum uptake, some of it's uptake related to integration of family planning programs. But the top 4 priorities for research in the next few years, according to the WHO's experts, are uptake, 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 uptake. And I know I don't need to convince this particular audience of demographers and researchers that measurement matters in all kinds of important ways. Like we're all coming with that. with that knowledge. But I love to show this quote from Sally Engle-Mary. She's an anthropologist, and she has this book called The Seductions of Quantification that I recommend really, really highly. And Mary writes that statistical knowledge is often viewed as non-political by its creators and users. It flies under the radar of social and political analysis as a form of power. Yet how such numerical assessments are created, produced, cast into the world, and used has significant implications for the way the world is understood and governed. So what she's saying is that although indicators may seem like an objective count of any given phenomenon, what we choose to count and how we choose to count that thing are political decisions that we're making every day that reflect our own political worldviews. And so I spend a lot of time in my work thinking through what are the tacit ideologies of our global family planning indicators? What types of power are these indicators wielding? Whose worldview do these indicators help us understand? And more importantly, whose worldviews are obscured by the indicators that we're currently using in family planning? And so here's a list of the most common population-based indicators that we have today in global family planning. In the absence of other information about a program, these are sort of the things that we tend to summarize so we can understand what's going on in any given place. And if you look at these measures, we can see measures of contraceptive method use, measures of fertility desires, age-specific fertility outcomes, right? But it might blow your mind, as it blew my mind when I first realized it, that like actually nothing here measures a health outcome. Nothing here is measuring reproductive rights. There's not a single measure of access, nothing about equity. Like that's not what we're measuring. So while our motivations for global family planning might have been radically transformed in the years since the Cairo conference, our measurements have not followed suit. And so that results in this really fundamental misalignment, right, between the stated goals that are guiding our programs on the one hand, and the way that we're evaluating progress towards those goals on the other hand. And that's not just like an academic question, right? That's not just a matter of academic interest, because what we measure and how has tremendous implications for how programs get funded, how they get designed, implemented, and evaluated. And this is particularly true in the global health world, right, where the importance of a discrete set of quantitative indicators can hardly be overstated. So think Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, how we conceptualize what progress looks like and then measure progress towards those outcomes is extremely salient for global health. And global family planning in particular has seen an increased reliance on quantitative target setting in the past decade. Some of you may be familiar with this initiative called Family Planning 2020, now Family Planning 2030. This was an initiative that began in 2012. It was funded in large part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the main objective of the project was to reach a quantitative target to add 120 million additional users of modern contraceptive methods by 2020 in the world's poorest countries. And in the words of the program's architects, the success of FP 2020 will first be evaluated on the basis of quantitative verification to determine that the 120 by 20 goal was reached. That overarching global target, 120 by 20, in turn spawned a range of regional and national goals that were pursued and measured in much the same way. Countries and regional initiatives made formal commitments to FP 2020, pledging to meet targets for contraceptive uptake. So this is one prominent example from the Ouagadougou Partnership, which was a regional initiative comprised of 9 countries from Francophone West Africa. And together, these 9 countries pledged to add a combined 2.2 million new users of family planning by 2020 across the 9 countries. And here's just one more example from Ghana. This was their commitment to the FP 2020 program. This included both an aim to increase modern contraceptive prevalence from 22% to 30% among married women, 32% to 40% among unmarried women. And very notably for Ghana, they also pulled from an existing population policy to affirm their goal of reducing total fertility from 5.5 children to 3 children per woman. And some governments set even more specific goals than that. This is a screenshot from the Burkina Faso National Plan to Accelerate Family Planning. For those of you for whom high school French is far away, let me translate it to English for you. And as you can see, the government set not only an overall target to get contraceptive prevalence up to 32% by 2020, but they also set method-specific targets to guide how they wanted to get there. So this plan for increasing contraceptive use focuses specifically on promoting long and medium acting methods of IUDs implants and injectables. So it's this global context that led to the two overarching research questions that really keep me up at night. The first of these questions is, what happens to people's experiences if and when fertility goals are what drive family planning programs? And the second question is, given the importance of these quantitative measures, how can we design a population-based indicator that measures and promotes the post-Cairo agenda of reproductive health and autonomy, as opposed to the pre-Cairo agenda of population control? So that's what inspired the Contraceptive Autonomy Study. The goals of this study are to understand how contraceptive coercion manifests and how to build a fundamentally new approach to family planning measurement that disavows our intellectual history and promotes a person-centered, an ideology of person-centered care and reproductive freedom. And so I'll spend the rest of our time together talking about this. So this was an exploratory sequential mixed method study that I designed using a formative qualitative phase to inform the development and implementation of a large-scale quantitative study. I'm going to anonymize the country setting for our purposes today. I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit more about that if folks are curious, but it's a country in sub-Saharan Africa that has won international acclaim for its family planning program in recent years. And the idea is that if coercion is found in this highly visible and award-winning program, it's reasonable for us to hypothesize that coercion might be a problem throughout similarly conceived family planning programs around the world. So our mixed research methods, our qualitative phase included in-depth interviews with women of reproductive age, focus group discussions, and key informant interviews with health administrators. This helped us understand what kind of experiences people were having, what was the language that they used to talk about their experiences, and that helped us think through what kind of novel survey questions might make sense given those experiences. So then we used the data from that phase to develop a novel questionnaire that we implemented at two health and demographic surveillance system research sites with over 3,900 women of reproductive age. And I'm going to give a super tiny overview of some of the qualitative findings before I move on to focus on the measurement development part. So the main things to come out of this qualitative phase that I want to highlight for you today is what I call this comprehensive theory of coercion. And this theory has three components. The first is that coercion sits on a spectrum. The second is that coercion is structural. And the third is that coercion can be bidirectional. And I'll explain briefly what I mean by each of these. So the spectrum of coercion is maybe my favorite or most important finding of this work. We have tended in the past to think of coercion as a binary outcome. Either there's really bad coercion or there's no coercion at all. But I argue that it's much more helpful to conceptualize coercion as an array of practices that exist to limit contraceptive decision-making, ranging from the subtle to the overt. Things like biased counseling, limited method mix, provision of false medical information are mapped here as subtle coercion. Threats to deny future care, scare tactics, or insisting until a person accepts a method are mapped as moderate coercion, and inserting methods without consent or refusing to remove LARC methods are mapped onto the more overt ends of the spectrum. And this helps us understand something like a limited method mix, which hasn't been thought of as something related to coercion before, as a way that structural forces can limit contraceptive autonomy. So here's an example of what we mean when we talk about subtle coercion. This is Maria's story. We asked Maria to tell us about her contraceptive counseling experience, and Maria tells us, well, the health workers normally counsel you that if you want to choose, you have to choose the 5 years, by which she means the implant. Now, if that method isn't suitable for you, you can take it out and get the 3 months injectables. But if you don't like that, you can't take it out. You have to wait for the 3 months to be over, otherwise you can't remove it. So it's the providers who told you. It's true that there's counseling. They tell you to choose what you like, but what they think is best, it's only the 5 years, the implant. So I've called this type of biased and directive counseling subtle coercion. There's no use of threats or violence, right? But it's really clear that Maria is describing a situation that constrains contraceptive autonomy. And now here's an example of what we're calling overt coercion from our sample. This is Jessica's story. Jessica tells us, when I got pregnant with my 10th child, the midwife told me that I have a lot of children and that I would have a difficult delivery. The health workers in a nearby town said that I needed to get the implant by force. I was obligated to accept, and they gave me the implant. The nurse told me that it would be 5 years, and even before the date of the 5th year, I started to feel illnesses due to the implant. I went to tell the hospital that I got headaches from the implant, And it's there that the health worker told me that the date to remove it hasn't yet arrived, so he can't remove it. He refused. He said that it hasn't yet been 5 years and there are 2 months that still remain. So there's a lot going on in this quote, right? We could probably spend the rest of the time together unpacking this, but I'm just gonna focus on a few key things. Jessica was forced to get contraception and she was forced to get an implant. So no choice about whether or not to use it all, and then no choice about what method to use based on the provider's perception of high parity. And then instead of viewing the 5-year duration of the implant as the maximum period of efficacy, as intended, many women told us stories like this of providers treating that 5-year duration of use as the minimum period rather than the maximum, categorically refusing to take them out before the time had completely elapsed. And in this case, you can see that Jessica's had the method for well over 4 years, and the provider is still refusing to allow her to discontinue. Another part of this theory is something that I glossed over briefly, but we're calling it structural coercion. So this is not just because of a meanie or a butthead, right? These are structural forces at work. So we interviewed health administrators, and one of the administrators told us at the district level, we also give goals to each health center so that they can attain the targets. Those are concerned with all of the methods mixed together, but above all, the long-acting methods that we're really emphasizing. So that quote can really help us gain an understanding of contraceptive coercion as something that's stemming from policies and programs, rather than something that's the result of a few bad apples. In much of the thinking around coercion, we tend to focus on intent to coerce, provider bias, things like that have really distracted us from understanding the root causes of coercion. Instead of blaming providers, if we understand coercion structural, that can help us reframe the situation, place the critique back onto the donors and the program designers in the global north, right? These systems were designed with the express goal of achieving high contraceptive uptake. So we shouldn't blame providers or act all surprised when rights and autonomy are being subordinated to reach those goals. Oops, sorry, I forgot to show you the words for that. And then finally, this is a little schematic to demonstrate what I mean when I talk about the bidirectionality of coercion. Traditionally, coercion has been conceived of as a force that compels someone to use a method that they don't want, like the examples that I've shown today. And this is indeed a very troubling form of coercion, of course, but it's not the only form. So what about when people are deprived of a method that they do want? What should we call that? Here, I call the inability to use a wanted contraceptive method a form of downward coercion in contrast to upward coercion that Jessica and Maria were facing. And so bringing all of these ideas together, my theory really rests on the contention that all obstructions to contraceptive autonomy, upward and downward, structural and interpersonal, subtle and overt, should be understood and analyzed as various iterations of the same process, which is coercion. That was the easy part. Now comes the hard part, which is how do we design some novel survey questions and a new quantitative indicator to measure this nuanced, complex, expansive understanding of contraceptive coercion. So here we go. How do we measure contraceptive autonomy? It is hard. Spoiler alert. It is really hard. We knew we had to do something pretty different from the status quo, because for most of recent history, the outcome of interest for family planning has been contraceptive use, and we've been defining this and measuring it in a super straightforward way. A person using a method is a good outcome, and a person not using a method is a bad outcome. And this simple dichotomous understanding is at the core of just about every population-based indicator that we have, including contraceptive prevalence, unmet need, et cetera, et cetera. But if we add just one additional criterion, and we also begin to examine the extent to which a person can actually wants a family planning method, we can begin to create a more person-centered understanding. And so I ask, if we add the second criterion, is the column to the right still always good? Is the column to the left still always bad? I suggest a new definition of success that's not dependent on the person's status as a contraceptive user or non-user, but rather on concordance between what the person wants and what they have. And it's based on this concordance that I propose a new measure called contraceptive autonomy. And now comes the really hard part, because what does it mean to want family planning? How can we create a measurement around this? As I'm sure we all know, a lot more goes into autonomous decision-making than just a person's feelings, right? It's a lot more complex than just our feelings. So the way we tried to operationalize this part of the schematic was to think about wanting a method as having the factors that are necessary for a person to decide for themselves what it is they want in regards to contraception, and then the ability to realize that. decision. And then using that definition, I drew from the work of Karen Newman and Charlotte Feldman-Jacobs at PRB to identify these 3 subdomains of contraceptive autonomy: informed choice, full choice, and free choice. And so in the operational definition of informed choice, someone needs to have sufficient unbiased information about a range of family planning options, including both the benefits and the risks of both use and non-use. For full choice, a person needs to have access to a sufficiently wide range of methods from which to choose. And for free choice, a person needs to make a decision about whether or not to use contraception and what method to use voluntarily without barriers or coercion. Okay, so we have these 3 subdomains, and now we're thinking about what questions we can develop to measure each one of these domains. And so before I go on to the algorithm itself, I'm sorry, I think it might be a little bit light for some of you, but I want to talk about what we're calling contraceptive attribute groups, and have you sort of hold on to this in your mind when I go on to the next slide. It's unreasonable to expect any health system, no matter how good, right, to be able to offer every single contraceptive method to every single person every single time. That's not a reasonable aspiration. So here I've tried to enumerate the basic qualities and attributes that a well-rounded contraceptive method mix might have that would provide folks a sufficiently wide selection, even in the absence of some methods. So for example, someone should have access to a long-acting and a short-acting method, a hormonal and a non-hormonal method, a coitally dependent and a coitally independent method, etc. So this is what I mean when I talk about contraceptive attribute groups. And now here's our algorithm. So I propose that we measure informed choice as knowing how to use at least one method from each of those attribute groups, knowing a benefit of contraceptive non-use as well as a risk. If a person is a current user, we add that they should know both a benefit and a risk of their current method, and that they know what to do in case of side effects. If that's ringing a bell for you, that's the method information index that's embedded in there. If they're a LARC or a permanent method user, we add that they should have either been told about method removal or permanence at the time of method provision. For full choice, we say that someone should have a method from each attribute group both available and affordable to them. And for LARC users, we further specify that removal services should be available and affordable. And then for free choice, we say that people should have made the choice to use family planning voluntarily. They should not have been offered to use incentives, either to use a method or not to use a method. And then for current users, we add that they should have felt able to refuse a method, and that they're not using their method against their will. And for LARC users, they should not have met provider resistance to discontinuation. So that's the algorithm. And then when we thought through how to bring all of those separate items together, we thought through a few different variations of this. One is an all or nothing, where the idea is that contraceptive autonomy is mutually constitutive. Like you either have it or you don't. If you're missing one part of this, you don't have contraceptive autonomy. So that's the top version, the all or nothing version. And then we also have a shades of gray version, which thinks like, okay, so fine, you didn't have access to information about all the methods, but you had everything else. So you should still get some credit for all of the things you have. So we test both of these concepts out, and I'll show some examples at the end and talk through some of the advantages and disadvantages of both of these approaches. So now if we go back to our contingency table, we can conceptualize who falls into each of these cells. In box A, we have people who made a free, full, and informed decision not to use. In box B, we have people who are using a family planning method but did not have information access or freedom in that choice, people who are using a method. This might remind you of upward coercion from the qualitative work. In box C, we have people who do not have a method, but they didn't have full information access or freedom in their choice not to use. This might look like downward coercion from the qualitative. And in box D, we have fully autonomous contraceptive users. And the way we're bringing this all together, there are a few indicators that we're thinking of here. One is a radical redefinition of unmet need based on this concept. One is an autonomy-adjusted contraceptive prevalence. But for today, I'm going to focus on our main indicator, which is the contraceptive autonomy score. And it's really simple. It's a proportion of autonomous people over the population as a whole, which is just A plus D over A plus B plus C plus D in this schematic. And this might not seem like that big of a deal, especially for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with family planning. You might be thinking, so what? But to my knowledge, this is the first indicator for family planning that acknowledges that autonomous non-use of contraception is a perfectly good outcome. And so the idea here is that if we pursued contraceptive autonomy targets instead of contraceptive uptake targets, we could eliminate some of those structural incentives for coercion. And I'll plug here that this study came out this past year in Studies in Family Planning. I'm going to go over the results super briefly, but if you're interested, this is out and it's open access. But this is just some of our preliminary results. The pink bar on the left represents contraceptive autonomy for non-users. The green bar is all contraceptive users. Yellow bar is non-LARC users, so users of short-acting methods. Blue is LARC users, and the gray bar is everyone in the sample. And so what you can see here is a little bit of variation across the groups, but we were actually surprised that the results are pretty consistent across the board. Informed choice is sort of universally at the floor. Between 6 and 15% of respondents reported this is the all or nothing approach. So between 6 and 15% of respondents reported having all of the criteria for informed choice. Levels of full choice were higher, but still not high, hovering at about half the sample. And levels of free choice were much, much higher, hovering at around 95% for all of the groups, regardless of contraceptive use status. And remember, this is all or nothing. So you have to have all three of these things to have contraceptive autonomy. So when we bring these all together, we see incredibly low levels of overall contraceptive autonomy, ranging from 4% among LARC users to 8% among non-users, and averaging about 7% for the population as a whole. This is what it looks like when we take that shades of gray approach, where you get sort of credit for the things you have and are only decremented for the ones you don't have. We see levels of informed choice now much closer to the 50, 60, 70% range. Full choice is between 60 and 80%, and free choice is up about 97% for all groups. And of course, because of how we're putting this together, overall contraceptive autonomy now is much higher too, ranging from 71% to 86%. I really want to caution, this is something we went through with the peer reviewers a lot. I really want to caution against the direct comparison of these two approaches, and given their varying interpretation. The all or nothing approach is the proportion of women with all the subdomains of contraceptive autonomy, whereas the shades of gray approach is the proportion of subdomains of contraceptive autonomy that the average woman had. So those are really different things that they're measuring. And we're trying to think through like which of those is the right thing to measure, or the better thing to measure. The all or nothing is much stricter in its adherence to the conceptual underpinnings of the indicator, and it's perhaps a truer measurement of the construct of contraceptive autonomy. But this sort of conceptual clarity comes at the cost of sensitivity to change. All or nothing is going to be really hard to change. You might improve a lot and have it not reflected at all, right? Because you haven't improved on every single subdomain. So it may fail to reflect important but incomplete improvements in contraceptive autonomy. This shades of gray approach is going to be much more sensitive to small changes over time, but that sensitivity to change really comes at a sort of the cost of conceptual haziness, I think. It's really unclear to people what this is measuring. People are misinterpreting it routinely. And so I think we have to be just careful about that and really clear about what it is doing. One advantage that this might offer is that this approach allows us to consider perhaps a weighting scheme later on, where some of the things that we think are like more important and really much more important to contraceptive autonomy can take on greater weight compared to some of the less important items. That's a great segue, I think, into some of the lingering measurement challenges that we're dealing here. I really want to emphasize to you all that this is not a final validated measure, far from it. I'd say we're at the beginning of what I expect to be a very long journey into figuring out how to measure this very complex construct. I don't have time to talk about all of the things that we're noodling over, but let me just give one example. How to measure free choice. Long story short is that this is really hard. I don't think we did a great job our first time around. I don't think we measured it very well. That qualitative data that I discussed with you earlier suggested pretty strongly that pressure to use methods and provider reluctance to remove LARC was commonplace in these communities. But of course, those qual methods can't be used to measure prevalence, of course. But when we asked in our quantitative survey, we saw that very few people were responding yes to feelings of pressure or non-voluntarism. And one explanation for this could be that truly there's not much experience of that in our sample, and that our questions are revealing a really accurate estimation of these low population levels of coercion. That's a totally plausible explanation. I'm more inclined to think that it is much more common than our questions are revealing, and that our qualitative results were really telling us that something important was going on here, but we just haven't figured out the way to measure it yet. So there's a lot at play here, including women perhaps not wanting to admit to themselves that they were coerced, or doing some post hoc work in their minds to reconcile their cognitive dissonance. We have a social desirability bias, perhaps not wanting to admit to an interviewer what's going on, especially because a lot of people aren't able to disentangle like who's a nurse from the health system and who's just a researcher. And those things are really mixed together in this context. I think we're also dealing with a normalization of disrespect and abuse from healthcare workers. That's a really strong element here. And so there's a lot of things that we can think of as affecting our ability to measure free choice. Some of these things might be addressable with better survey design, more cognitive testing, better question wording in the future, but we might also be facing sort of a fundamental issue of something that can't be measured accurately with survey research, something like abortion prevalence or something like that, where it's just like, well, survey is not the right tool to capture this. So lots of work still to do here. Looking forward, methodologically, we're planning on using a range of multidimensional latent variable modeling techniques in the future, including multiple indicator, multiple cause models, to try to narrow these scores of possible items down into a select few that tell us the most about contraceptive autonomy in the most parsimonious way, because I'm very aware that I can't go to DHS with 20 questions and ask them to put that on. So hopefully this will help us generate some evidence around measurement validity, as well as reducing the overall number of survey items to a more manageable survey burden. The long-term vision for this project is to have this indicator measured around the world, wherever there's family planning. I'd love for this to be measured. And since routine measurement is key, the goal is to develop a module that's concise enough and important enough to go onto the NSFG, the DHS, et cetera. And so institutionalizing this indicator would allow for its widespread calculation and comparison across time and place. And so just to sum up really briefly, what I hope we can all take away from this, contraceptive autonomy helps to conceptualize contraceptive coercion and choice, situating these phenomena as part of a racialized, gendered, and politically contested development initiative. Our study finds that a range of coercive practices, from the subtle to the overt, can be found even in a model family planning program when that program is motivated by contraceptive uptake targets. And that new modes of measurement can help show the ways that programs are providing or failing to provide person-centered care. These arguments argue for an anti-colonial and justice-based approach to global reproductive health that strips the power away from philanthrocapitalists and from governments in the global north, and instead resituates the locus of power and decision-making within the communities who are affected by these types of policies. And we need to develop a new range of quantitative measures that center the voices of contraceptive users and their own desires for their bodies and their lives. And so I'll say that this study is a small step on that path, but there's a really, really long way to go. And so with that, I'd really like to thank the funders of this project, without whom it wouldn't have been possible. And thank you all so much for coming and listening to what I have to say.
We have time for some questions.
Did I go over time?
No.
Okay.
So I think this is really important work, and but you probably know how many versions the population wants. Yeah, she was a senior.
Oh, great.
So
That's one of my favorites. Yeah.
And I could see it. So I have lots of questions, but let me start with one that's sort of a big one from the point of view of the lay demographers have tried to get this, which is the measure of, the unmet need measure. And the idea of that, as I understood it, was always that you were comparing use of family planning to the subject's own desires and desires. So if you had, if they say that their ideal family size is 5 and they only have 3 children, then that's not, that doesn't go into unmet need. So I assume you have a critique of that measure.
Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. It was published in PDR actually in 2022. No, 2022. March 2022. I'd be happy to share that. I have a long critique of unmet need. I could spend the next hour talking to you about everything I think is wrong with that measure. But you're exactly right. The unmet need is comparing current contraceptive use and 2-year pregnancy intentions. And so the idea is, if you don't want to get pregnant within the next 2 years, and you're not using a method of contraception, that you have an unmet need. What it's ignoring is the fact that there are lots of reasons why people might not want to get pregnant and also not want to use contraception. A really obvious issue with unmet need is that it includes all married people as at risk for pregnancy, even if they're not having sex. So infrequent sex, if you look at the DHS data, is the #1 reason for contraceptive non-use among people who don't want to, is the #1 reason for contraceptive non-use among people who are ascribed an unmet need. Do people who aren't having sex need to be using a method of contraception to avoid pregnancy? I'd argue not so much. And so I could keep going on and on and on, but basically it's not asking people if they want to use contraception. It's asking them about their fertility desires. And there's a small but important conceptual distinction between wanting to avoid a pregnancy and wanting to use contraception that I think we haven't paid enough attention to as a community. And I'm happy to talk about this a whole lot more.
There's also all the pregnancy ambivalence. Like, do you want to be pregnant?
That's
a really
a
broad
huge,
thing.
I mean, my paper in PDR goes into this a lot, that like, there's almost 20 years now of really important research about what it means to measure pregnancy intentions as a binary and how unstable of a concept that is, that I think really destabilizes the unmet need measure as well. That's a great point. Thank you for that.
I'm interested in the downward coercion,
Mhm.
because I guess, I mean, so my first thought was what you later talked about, which is that like you can't expect every family planning clinic to offer every, option of family planning. But to me, I guess like I'm having a little trouble with the word coercion for that direction, because to me it seems like some kind of lack of access or inability to realize your desires, but not to be coerced into an action. It's like an inaction versus an action.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It took me a while to come around to this also.
Yeah.
One reason we decided to call it that is because a lot of it was sort of the interpersonal stuff, it's sort of what in global family planning we talk about when we talk about provider bias. So providers saying, you're unmarried and too young, you shouldn't be here, I'm going to tell your mother, get out, and like chasing younger women outside of the clinic. So we needed a way to include that kind of behavior. And then the longer I spent thinking about it, the longer I spent talking to myself about what's the difference between when that happens interpersonally and when that happens structurally. So I draw a lot from the conception of structural violence when I think about this stuff, and I think about what's the difference to me as a user, whether or not I can't get my family planning method because this provider is categorically refusing to give it to me because they don't think I should have it, or because my country's so impoverished and my Minister of Health didn't think that this was important enough to put a line item in the budget, and so this clinic doesn't have it.
Yeah.
And so I really started thinking that, like, to me as a person, my experience of it is the same, which is that I'm not able to express my contraceptive autonomy the way I want to. Of course, the solution to those two problems is really different, right? Whether it's an interpersonal reason for downward coercion or a structural one. But I do think that conceptualizing it as two sides of the same coin is really important, as we're like entering, I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you, we're in a moment where the bodies of people with uteruses are under attack and seeking to be controlled in a bunch of different ways. We have pronatalists trying to do this crazy thing over here, and we have antinatalists trying to do this crazy thing over here, and we have billionaires funding weird research initiatives about all this stuff, right? And I think that like mapping the pronatalist attempts to control reproduction and the antinatalist attempts to control reproduction as two sides of the same coin really helps us gain some clarity in terms of how we should move forward to address it.
A clarification question about the shades of gray measure. Can you show that?
Yes, of course.
So my understanding correctly that.
This one or the
The
results?
Yeah, great. So am I understanding correctly that here it's not actually a percentage of women, it's like the average.
Yes,
women
exactly. Yep.
Position?
Yep.
And so I was just curious, does that mean every item is weighted equally
Yes.
across all three domains?
Yes.
And does each domain have the same number of items?
No, there's a lot from like a purely measurement point of view, there's a lot that's wrong with the way we're doing this. That like I think would make like a formal measurement person's head explode. We're applying, so each item is, it's not by domain, it's by item. So each of the items is weighted exactly the same. We could adjust that. That's like, I think one of the advantages that like, if we think that using the method against your will is actually more important, we could weight that higher, which is an advantage of this approach. But anything with an asterisk next to it is only asked to some people, not everybody. That's not ideal, right? From a measurement perspective, that's actually pretty, it's actually pretty terrible from a measurement perspective, because users now have to meet more criteria than non-users. And ideally in a measurement, we're subjecting everyone to the same criteria. But I couldn't figure out a way to do this that didn't ask LARC users, could you discontinue, right? Which like, we can't ask that to non-LARC users, and yet it's a really important part of this for LARC users. So we're still noodling over how to do this. It seems to me that if you're using a medical device, there's a higher sort of standard of information that people who aren't using that medical device shouldn't be held to. But ideally at a population-based measure, we're not holding people to different standards, we're holding everyone to the same standard. So welcome thoughts on how to navigate this.
I have a chat question from Laura Lindbergh is with us, and she said that she would love to hear more about your take on the role of private philanthropy in this.
Laura's trying to get me in trouble. It's, I think, very clear to me that there's a like fundamentally undemocratic nature to the way that private philanthropists wield power in the global health sphere. For all of the problems that we have with the WHO, it's a democratically elected body with representation from all over the world. As far as I know, no one elected certain billionaires to have as much control as they do over the agenda. And for all of the good intentions, I think that there's the capacity for a great deal of harm from people moving into spaces where they might not necessarily have either the sort of academic expertise or the lived experiences to sort of understand what solutions should be. And there, as far as I'm concerned, top-down programs they won't work in the long run. And the only solution, the only way forward is for communities to be responsible for their own solutions. And I guess what I'd like is for the billionaires to like pay more taxes and for them not to be billionaires anymore, and for governments and democratically elected bodies to be able to redistribute that money in the ways that make the most sense for the communities. Thank you, Laura, for that question.
I mean, I also think about the Gates Foundation, for example, who didn't touch family planning for years because of their religious affiliation. It felt antithetical to what their view of the world should be, and then came into this space like guns blazing. They set the goals. They provided the funding. They overshadowed USAID funding by 10 times or something. And so the only way to work in this space was to follow their framework. And so only to say that it has both sort of effects on the overall way that we talk about these things, but then also the way we actually can do, anyone can do any work in the space.
Yeah, I mean, the way that their wealth affords them the power to set the agenda for like, this is how we're going to do things. This is identifying what the problems are, which may or may not be the real problems, and then identifying the solutions to those problems, which may or may not be helpful solutions. I think are always that philanthrocapitalists can skew things. There's a book that's it's hard to get your hands on, but it's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it's about the way that NGOs and philanthropists like sap radical organizing power and render it less radical. That I'd recommend folks check out if they're interested in this.
Looking at the informed choice thing, and I feel like there's There's an issue that I have with it, which is that it requires quite a high degree of literacy and ability to kind of take a test on the part of the person. Like, it feels a little quizzy, especially like the benefit advantage, risk disadvantage. Like I can imagine somebody being told all of that, maybe like not quite remembering one for each group, or like and also like that there's a lot of cultural variation in the degree to which people feel comfortable kind of offering formal information like this. I don't know. Have you
Just to clarify, we don't ask them what the risk or advantage is. We just say, do you know how?
Okay.
Do you know one?
Got
And
it.
we're not like measuring whether or not it's
Okay.
correct or
That
incorrect.
helps. Yeah.
A lot of, I would 100% agree that this is not an ideal way to measure informed choice. Knowing that we couldn't add as many questions as we wanted to the DHS, a lot of this was based on what the DHS is already measuring. And so, like I said, the method information index is embedded in here. I think this is the hardest subdomain to measure. This one is conceptually easier. I mean, measuring it's really hard, but conceptually, free choice is easy to measure because everyone should always have all free choice. Deciding what level of information people need to have in order to make an informed choice is a normative decision that we are super struggling with. Maybe people don't need it. Maybe they should just have the right to say, no, I don't want it. And we shouldn't say, okay, but you don't know enough to make that information, right? Maybe we should completely just trust people to know whether they care about this or want to know more. Or maybe they shouldn't be able to, we shouldn't say you have an informed choice if you've never heard of contraception, right? And there's sort of two extremes there, and we're trying to land somewhere in the middle, but very open to critique about whether or not we sort of hit a sweet spot. And especially trying to measure it with yes, no questions and questions that are already on the DHS has proved quite challenging. Yeah.
I had a question about the structural coercion piece. One thing that I found really interesting was you mentioned that these like health centers, one of the health admins said that the health centers have like goals or targets for enforcing quote unquote contraception. I was wondering like where are they getting those numbers from? Are they coming from like certain actors or like governments or funders or?
A lot of it is like I said, those commitments that the countries are making to this FP 2020 initiative, now FP 2030. So for a government I'm just gonna make up some numbers, but like a government commits to 400,000 new users of contraception. That's their pledge. In the country where we did the research, it was somewhere around that. Then they break up that target by year. So they have their yearly target, and then they break it up by region, and then province, and then district, and then health center. So each health center essentially is getting a de facto quota from the government, which has made this pledge to this sort of global health initiative. And they're getting funding. So the providers know this is our target for the year. And if they don't get it, they're, I don't want to say punished, but they are made to know that they did not meet their target. And if they meet their target, they are made to know that they met their target. There's other aspects to it too, even in the absence of this initiative and these targets. I looked at the health registers, like they're handwritten, like there's ledgers with all these columns, and that's how the visits are recorded. And for family planning and some of the health centers that I visited, there's only a column for which method the person left with. There's no way to mark down received counseling, chose not to get a method, and left. And so if you can't get the person to leave with a method, you don't have anything to write down. And then when your supervisor comes to see, what did you do today? Your ledger's empty. So there's little things like that. The ways that programs are designed to capture outcomes are all structured on like uptake is the thing that counts. And there's no way really for people to get credit for letting people leave the health center without a method.
We actually need to wrap up. I'm so sorry. But we'll go ahead and wrap this up there. Thank you so much, Leigh. Thank you to everyone with questions. We will still be here and then meeting with trainees for the next half hour. So thank you.
Thanks for being here.